some cases of crisis telepathy, where individuals receive a strong feeling or mental impression that someone else is in danger. The concurrence of feeling of crisis and actual crisis happening elsewhere will of course occur from time to time, chance alone, and in everyday life. One can never rule out the possibility of experience not genuine PSI. Clearly, more cause one person has to worry about another. For example, the distant person is ill or involved in a dangerous situation such as war. More frequently feeling the danger of poor body are likely to incur, increasing the likelihood or chance of coincidence resembling crisis telepathy. However, there are numerous instances where one person has received a clear impression of danger in situations where there was no prior reason or concern. For such cases are less easily dismissed.
Cedarburg, Wisconsin is the home of Mrs. Joyce Hirth. One evening in 1955, her husband and son had gone to the movies. Mrs. Hirth's 5-year-old daughter, little Joycey, came back late from a birthday party and rushed off to join them. The movie theatre was in the main street. Her mother was at home with the washing up.
She waved goodbye to me and skipped up the street, and it wasn't very long until all of a sudden I felt a terrible chill that went all through me. I dropped the plate I was washing and raised my eyes to heaven, and I said, "Oh God, don't let her get killed." At that moment, I knew something awful had happened to my daughter. I immediately went to the telephone. I could hardly dial because I was shaking so. I picked up the receiver. I did get the Rivoli Theater, and a young girl answered the phone. I said, "This is Mrs. Hirth. My daughter was on the way to the theater. She's had an accident. Is she badly hurt?" The girl stammered, "Mrs. Hirth, the accident just happened."
Little Joycey had been hit by a car outside the Rivoli. Manager Ray Nichols remembers how quickly the call came.
There was no way that anybody could have got down and talked to Mrs. Hirth about her daughter, because the phone rang shortly. It couldn't have been a few seconds after that her daughter was hurt, and she says, "Was my daughter hurt?" So I didn't know how she could find out, but it must be about, what, a block and a half, 2 blocks to her home from here. If they'd had a motorcycle waiting for this to happen, they couldn't have got down there in the time for her to call by the time her daughter got hurt.
If you take the shortcut, you go up this street, and just before the corner, there's a parking lot. And you can go through the parking lot and between 2 buildings and come out immediately in front of the theater. There's no way I could see it from this angle. It's all at the upper part of the street. I couldn't possibly see it, and on a different street.
After the accident, little Joyce's first thought was for her mother.
And she said, "Mama," I sat on the curb and I kept saying, "Mama, Mama, I want my mama," but not out loud, just to myself, she said. I didn't hear any sounds whatsoever. I had a feeling of terror that ran all through me. I knew she had had an accident. Now, whether I knew it at the time she was hit or whether I had picked up her thought of calling me just a few seconds later, I don't know.
It had to be extrasensory perception, because there was no other way she could have known. No way.
And here's an example of telepathy. Carolyn Brown and her boyfriend Gordon Woods shared a telepathic connection, like identical twins, that allowed him to find her body the night she died. One of Brown's closest friends recalled Mr. Wood telling her Mr. Wood had pleaded not guilty to the NSW Supreme Court to Brown's murder. It had been alleged that he threw Brent off a cliff at Watson's Bay in Sydney's east. Actor and model Kylie Watson gave evidence yesterday, and she told court she looked up to Brown, her friend and mentor, who was 7 years her senior. And after Brown's death, she fell into a depression. Mrs. Watson told the jury Mr. Wood called her and told her he wanted to explain things about why Brown killed herself. About 3 weeks after Brown's death, she was a manic depressive and was on medication and had stopped taking it. Mrs. Watson recalled Mr. Wood telling her. He also told her how alarm bells went off the day she died when he woke to find Brown missing from their flat, and how he came to to find her body at the Gap. He and Caroline had some degree of telepathic connection. He described it as being identical twins, feeling each other's pain. Mrs. Watson said Mr. Wood described Brown's body as being found head first and really messed up. According to Mrs. Watson, who struggled to hold back tears as she gave her evidence, he said he had seen her in the morgue and there was no life in her. Her personality wasn't there. A body without any air in it. Mrs. Watson told the court. Mr. Wood also gave Mrs. Watson Brown's watch, which was tendered in the court as an exhibit. Mrs. Watson and Brown always wore that watch, and whether she was at the gym or shopping at home. Earlier, restaurateur Lance Melbourne was about the accuracy of testimony of 2 men saw at the Gap with a woman who looked like Brown. He identified Mrs. Woods and Adam Lay, who booked modeling jobs for both Brown and Mrs. Watson, as being the 2 men. Telepathy exposed communication between 2 persons without recourse of senses.
Telepathy tennis, anyone? You and your friend are going to play this game where you swap pictures and send them in your minds. Playing this game over and over again will open up your psychic abilities, and you'll be able to receive instant messages from your friends during the day without playing the psychic game. Next time something big happens to them, you'll be the first one to know about it. Okay. Once you get this game down pat, you'll find that it's easier to communicate with like a pet or a person that you're closer with.
You'll find that it's easier to communicate with your pet or a relative that's a long distance away. One glance from Fido
Or Sparky or Snappy,
and you'll understand his needs.
and you'll know exactly what's going on in his head.
You'll know when Aunt May is going to call and what she's going to say.
And you just look at the phone and all of a sudden it's her.
You'll also be able to read people who you've just met or who you just want to get to know better.
And orange. Okay, so what you do is you want to be as close to the person as you can possibly be if you're starting out.
Yes. All right, and then I'll be the sender and Marn will be the receiver.
Yeah.
And what you do is you go back to back if you're starting out, and you link arms and you hold them
Yeah, okay, and you want to go into a state of hypnosis.
with relaxed breathing. Send.
Red?
No.
Blue.
Yes.
Really?
Yeah.
Sweet. Okay, you also have to remember that if you ever get tired or bored, you may want to stop for one day because it may interfere with all your telepathic brainwaves.
You'll also be able to read people who you've just met or who you just want to get to know better.
I don't mind if you don't mind, 'cause I don't shine if you don't shine before